speak for Chomsky, and the two men overlapped a bit. But Skinner, it was that behaviorism. And I was thinking last night, do you train dogs to do tricks here ever?
Yeah.
You teach your dog to sit, you teach your dog to roll over or something. And usually the way we do it is the dog starts to do right, and we give them a little piece of a treat, a little bit of meat, a little bit of those dog biscuits or something. And we reward them, and they learn to do. Well, Skinner didn't usually use dogs, he used mice and pigeons. But he was training them to go through mazes and to recognize designs and things by giving them little bits of food, and they learned to do things. He was teaching them by reinforcement, okay? And he learned a lot about how often you give food and what you can teach. But he was saying that that's the way all human learning works. And people didn't really like that. They felt like, come on, a baby is not a mouse or a pigeon, Baby human beings are a little bit different. They have a different kind of brain. And Skinner was kind of, oh yeah, prove it, okay? He was arguing that that's how we learn. And so when Chomsky, in his writing in 59, he did a good job of showing that can't be the only way that babies learn language. Might be a little bit of it, and maybe they learn not to touch the hot stove that way. But when they're learning language, there's something else going on. And he started out by showing that there are some things that happen in language where there's a rule that explains a whole lot of things all at once. And it sure looks like babies are figuring out rules. Now, Chomsky did not spend his time with babies. I mean, he had a daughter, but he never studied babies, and he never studied language teaching. He wanted to find out what's in the brain. But the Chomsky people will point out that it can't be that children just copy what they hear. Children say things they've never heard before. And children come up with rules. They've never heard their parents or anyone around them say it, but they invent a rule and try it. And you'll see that with little kids. I remember my daughter would say, she knowed. Teacher knowed I couldn't do this, okay? Well, we never said knowed. We said she knew. And I can that one, we were going to preschool. She was just 3, and we were showing her the school the first time. And she was so excited afterwards. She knowed. And I tried to model good English. What was it she knew? She said, teacher knowed I can't get on the potty by myself. There was a little stool to help her get up on the toilet. And she was so worried. What if I go to school and I can't use the toilet? But teacher knowed, okay? Well, she didn't learn that by copying people and getting a reward. She had a rule in her mind. You make past by putting "ed" on the end. And kids do that. Well, there's a whole lot of other evidence. And there are mistakes that children never make. And Chomsky said it's because they have something going in their head. So, he talks about the language acquisition device. And people laugh. Okay, Chomsky, little black box inside our heads. What is this? But he was just saying there's a way the body learns language. And these people would say, look, we learned to walk on 2 feet. Our bodies are built for that. We don't crawl, we don't fly, we walk on 2 feet. And if your body is close to normal, you can't stop a kid from learning to walk on 2 feet. And they said, well, our brains are built for language. And if the brain is close to normal, the brain will learn language because that's the way the human brain works. And the brain will learn a human language. We don't learn Morse code, we don't learn computer languages, we learn human languages. And there seem to be some things that are the same in languages everywhere. Chomsky sometimes just made a good guess. He'd say, well, there's a lad, and the lad turns off at puberty. That's why you can't learn a language as well after you're an adult. Who knows if that's true or not? I'll tell you some people who are trying to find out at the end of my 15 minutes here. But he did very theoretical, and his followers was very theoretical. Can we develop some principles, some math that shows how sentences in any language come together? And so he wasn't studying babies, he wasn't studying language learning, he was thinking about what's going on inside the brain. And it was called UG, Universal Grammar, which isn't the same as Grammar Universal. It's Universal Grammar, UG. And for this part of linguistics, grammar isn't just syntax. It was always hard for everyone to get used to the idea. When he talked about universal grammar, he was talking about syntax, he was talking about phonology, he was talking about everything that is part of language. What's going on in the brain that we can describe? And I used to tell people when I was studying, I'll have to explain this reference, but I would say it might be like the search for the Northwest Passage. When Europeans first came to North America, they didn't know anything about the land, they didn't know how big the continent was, they didn't know where the mountains were, but they had in their minds that there was something like a river that went from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. They thought it might be about where the border between the United States and Canada is. And they were always out there in their sailing ships looking for the Northwest Passage. Well, they didn't find it because it doesn't exist, they couldn't find it, it isn't there. So I used to say, looking for UG might be like looking for the Northwest Passage. Maybe it's not there, but those explorers learned a lot about the geography of the Americas while they were looking for the Northwest Passage. And I think we can say that looking for UG helped people learn a lot about language. Might not be what we're going to do next year, but in last year, we learned a lot about language. And as you're working, every once in a while something would happen and you'd say, oh, that's got real potential. So his theory, it moved from the way it was at the very beginning. It was called kernel sentences and transformations. And then it was called government and binding. And then it became principles and parameters, which he would say, well, that's just an advanced form of government and binding. But the idea of principles and parameters, am I speaking too fast?
No. It's okay.
Okay. The idea of principles and parameters is that maybe there's some principles that are just kind of built into our brains. That's the way our brain organizes this information. But these principles might apply in two different ways. And that if you change one way of using the principle, it has many effects in the language. And if you put it the other way, it's a whole different way. So I'm going to show you one that sort of looks like it might be good, might not be, but this is the thing. There's an idea. I'm going to do it first in English, and then I'll see if you can recognize it. If I don't know, Johnny.
We should listen to yours.
What?
Okay, right now she hears.
Are you trying to speak, Diane? No. Okay. So I'm going to draw something up here. But the idea is that maybe, in this principle, that maybe when we put words together in our heads, that they always form phrases. And that the phrase, I'm just going to call it an X phrase right now, because it could be a noun phrase or a verb phrase or a prepositional phrase. But the idea is if you have an X phrase, it would have an X, that's the head, and it would have a complement, that it could have something else that would hook on, and that would be another phrase. I've put it down as a Y phrase right now. So, and this gets more complicated obviously, but if you had a verb phrase, well, there's a verb, and then there's a noun phrase, that's your object. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And they together make the verb phrase. Or if you had a prepositional phrase, well, the head, the X, would be a preposition, and the complement would be a noun phrase. If you had a noun phrase, this one does get a lot bigger. I'm giving you the simplest. But there would be an N for the noun. And here you might have a prepositional phrase, or you might have a clause, the box on the table, or the book that I read last week, or something. But the complement's over here. And if you have just a plain one piece, well, it's just a very small phrase. Okay? It'd be in, okay? But the idea is that our brain puts things together. We always have the head, and we have this place to put something more, another phrase. Okay, the idea is that that's a principle. All languages of the whole world, we could draw patterns like this for them. But there are two ways to do your phrase. I'm doing this like an English phrase. And in English, it's head first. So this verb is the head. It's first. And the complement is second. We go verb, object. In a prepositional phrase, they named a preposition because the preposition goes first. It's pre. And then here's the object of the preposition.
Right.
Or in noun phrases, the book on the table, we say book on the table. In Japanese, they go on the table book. Okay? So, does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, but at least they have, in some languages, they have something
Exactly.
that overlap, right?
Well, what happens, if I can flip this up, according to this theory, lots of languages aren't head first, they're head last. And so in a verb phrase, you have the verb. Oh, I didn't draw that one very well, okay? But the complement comes first because the head is last.
Yeah.
And so you say, in English you say drink water. In lots of languages, I think Azerbaijan, you say water, drink, right? And in lots of languages, if you have a prepositional phrase,
Let me help.
you have,
Noun phrase
and then the preposition. So you end up with table on,
yeah.
okay? And I had another example up here. What was it? I think in Japanese, you can say on the table, book. Or you say, that instead of saying book, that I read, in Japanese, it's that I read, book.
Yeah, the same for us.
Okay, it's same in Azerbaijani. So the idea is, maybe one of the reasons children can learn language so fast is they just have to hear a few sentences and they know that this is either a head first or a head last language. So if they hear water drink and bread eat, then they just assume that it will be table on and on the table book. They expect the head to be last. And if they hear a few sentences where the head is first, then they think all of these are going to be head first. And it would be a way that children could go, wow, I mean, obviously they aren't thinking metaphysically like I am, but it might be what's happening in their brains. And if this is true, it does have some application for us as language teachers. Because if you come from a head-first language and you're learning another head-first language, like English and learning Spanish, it doesn't feel weird. But if you go to learn Japanese, where it's head last, everything is kind of backwards and hard, and it takes you longer to get used to it. And this past weekend, I met an American man who has lived, he teaches English at some university, but he said he's lived in Baku for 17 years. And before he came here, he was in the Philippines, and he studied Tagalog. And he said he was the best student in his class. He mastered that language. It was really good. He could learn it. And he thought, I'm a good language learner. And then he came here, and everything on the sentences that he was laughing about, it's backwards. I'm looking for this word, and they say the whole sentence before they get to the word I want. And he's been here 17 years, and he still struggles with Azerbaijani because he's probably a good language learner, really, but it's just a harder change. Yes, you saw.
Microphone, mic.
Somebody else she doesn't want to dominate. Oh, okay, while you're passing the mic, have I talked too fast? Have I skipped an important point? Are you kind of getting the idea of what might be going on, or at least helping us learn how languages work? Yeah.
I think the Skinner theory is really easy for teaching any background of non-language, for second language. But if we take into consideration the theory of Chomsky, if each language make a framework about the similarities and differences for each language, it will be easier to teach.
That's the idea of the contrastive analysis.
Yeah.
If you looked at the language you're going to teach and compared it to the language your students speak, you might be able to help them. And that, we kind of think so from our experience as teachers. That's
Probably it will take lots of experiences to do it, but at least if there is a framework for each language, I think it perfectly works.
Okay. And it is true that we don't have to tell our students, we put the object after the verb in English. You can show them sentences where it says, I bread eat, I water drink, or whatever it is, water drink I, whatever sentences, and they begin to learn.